rigid Heddle weavers. Tammy Poff here, Poff Studio. If you follow my work at poffstudio.com or my Etsy shop or YouTube, you'll know that I've made it my mission to help weavers go beyond the rectangle. After we've done a dozen or so scarves, many of us yearn to make full garments from our little loom. And yet I find there's still a great deal of reluctance to begin to cut and sew on our carefully woven fabric. So that's why I'm here today to give you a few tips that might help a little with that anxiety. Okay, here's where we start. I recommend that you first locate a scrap of your woven fabric, or you make one. And I have here a few pieces of equipment I want to point out. I have an entry-level machine. This is a Babylock BL9. It handles heavy fabric well, but it's a very simple machine because I'm not going to ask you to do anything more than straight stitch and zigzag. And I've also added a walking foot. That's this little gadget you see here. That handles multiple thicknesses of fabric and heavier hand wovens because it sort of walks along the fabric surface. You'll want to choose a sewing thread that is a slight contrast to your woven fabric, because if you have to rip out, the stitching seems to disappear very rapidly into the depths of the fabric, and if you have just a little bit of contrast, it will be easier to rip out. Now, the first thing we want to do whenever we take our fabric off the loom, we want to get rid of fringe, is we do what I call a raw finish edge. And I've explained this in my book, Woven Style for the 15-inch rigid Heddle loom. What I would want you to do is assume this is the header that you wove in the beginning. And if you locate pick 1, I want you to stitch along picks 2 and 3 and fuse those two picks. That way, if your machine strays a bit, you won't be as likely to catch the scrap yarn from the header in that stitching. Now, when you start out, you want to make sure that your stitching goes off both selvage edges so that you catch all warp ends. And sometimes that means that at the starting edge that your machine could chew up a more delicate fabric. I normally first position my foot so that I'll be aiming at pick 2 and 3. And then I go forward from the selvage, maybe ½ an inch. And because the stitching may be hard to see as I go across, I'm going to take a look at where the foot lands and have that foot glide along a particular pick so that I stay on the straight and narrow. So having started about ½ inch forward of the selvage edge, and if I start stitching pick 2 and 3 together, just stitch a little bit. Then if you reverse, and once I reversed, I went backward off the far selvage edge, and you'll notice I stitched off the closer selvage edge. That catches all warp ends. Now I simply lift my foot and carefully turn the fabric. I'll plan now on stitching back over that first zigzag row. And I have used here, by the way, a stitch length on my machine that's about 3½, which is a little longer stitch, so I get the fusion of those two picks. You can either stitch over the top of the first row of stitching or a little inward from that. Either way works fine. And when I guide the fabric through, I like to grab both sides of the fabric and stabilize it that way. And I stitch off the edge, the beginning edge. Now what I can do is cut along pick 1, and I have a nice secure raw finish edge. So let's get to the real stuff. This is a pattern and a kit from my Etsy site for a shell that is made from one of my favorite yarns, Bee Sweet Bamboo. This is a hand-dyed yarn from Africa, And what I love about it is that you can beat it fairly hard and it still gives you a fabulous drape. And if there were wrinkles in the handling, in the wearing or the hanging of this garment, the wrinkles just fall right out. So I have recreated this piece with a variation without the silk ribbon. And I have a top piece and a bottom piece. And by now I have raw finished all my fringe ends. And I pieced the bottom ones together already. And the upper piece, per instructions, I have raw finished and turned to hem and stitched it. I call that a raw hem. And what you're supposed to do according to the pattern is center the top piece over the joined bottom pieces, and you'll have a little overlap on each side. And right now I'm allowed a 3/8 of an inch overlap seam here, and I have pinned the daylights out of it. There's a lot of pins in there so it won't shift, and I've taken the time to check that my selvage travels along pretty much the same pick along that lower edge. And now I think it's important for you to take the time to take a contrasting thread and about 1/4 inch away from the edge, run a basting stitch alongside those pins, about 1/4 inch away from the selvage, because these pieces, being slippery, will tend to shift while you're trying to stitch them. And I've got my pins here pointing to the right, because when I take this to the sewing machine, I'm going to leave some of the pins out. I'm going to remove about every other pin. But that just gives it a little added security to stay in place when I go to the machine. And if my pins are pointing up, when I turn this to sew, I like to have, this is a personal preference, I like to have my top layer on the left-hand side when I'm trying to sew close to the selvage edge. And I'll take those security pins out as I go. And now for the sewing. Now you know why I have pink thread on my sewing machine. It's just a slight contrast to this lavender. I didn't need that much contrast on my swatch. And I'm ready to sew really close to the overlapped edge here. Sometimes there's too much thickness to nicely slide under the sewing foot, so I will push the fabric under at a thinner spot and then back it in. I'm going to take the pin out at the beginning in order to do that. And I'm going to back it into place. And here again, I'm going to start about a 1/2 inch inward from where I really wanted to start my seam. And I'm going to put a seam in there that is about 1 pick in from the selvage. That's close to the edge. And I'm going to start by back stitching to where I actually want us to start. And as soon as I can get my fabric to extend past the walking foot here, and I can get my hands on the back, I'm going to want to grab the back so that this thicker, slippery fabric doesn't get caught and not progress forward. In other words, it helps to ease the fabric by grabbing it at the back. And I'm taking those pins out as I go. Stitching 1 pick away from the selvage and holding front and back so that it progresses evenly. To the other edge, I'm going to back stitch to secure. I trim all my little thread tails as I go Keeps things neater that way. And there's my securely stitched edge. By the way, I will suggest also, while you're basting, before you go to the stitching, check the back side to make sure that your basting caught all of the fabric before you sew. Voila. So now we've removed the basting, and if you have had any areas where the fabric slipped and you have an opening there, not to worry, just overlap it again carefully and stitch over that area. Don't back stitch the beginning and ending of that repair. Just pull the threads to the wrong side and tie them off that way. It'll never show. So that's as hard as it gets, folks. If you master the overlap seam on a slippery fabric and keep these handling tips in mind, all the traditional seaming and cutting will be a piece of cake. So for more information, please subscribe to this channel, and for updates on patterns, books, and more, please go to my website, pofstudio.com, and sign up for my email list. Thanks for joining me.